Hey y'all, and welcome once again to Santa Cruz County's #1 Google Slides stream, coming at you live from Middlesex County, Massachusetts, um, a part of the world where air conditioning is regularly used, so I apologize if that kicks on in the background while I am talking today. And let me just confess, I would really like a burger. You probably want a burger too, and that's fine, right? What's the problem with that? Well, let's talk about the devil for a minute. You know, you eat food, that means you open your mouth. You open your mouth, Satan might get in through your mouth hole. So, what do you do about that? Well, that's what today's shitty miracle is about. A miracle performed by one Saint Benedict. Now, Saint Benedict actually did a heck of miracles, some of which were quite good, as befits one of the greatest monks of all time. In terms not only of home runs but also of monasteries founded. Now we've talked before on this in the series about John Cassian, who's this monk who kind of brings Eastern traditions of monkhood to Western Europe, travels around a lot. Now John Cassian writes all that stuff out in a volume that I have in a modern edition. It's 1,000 pages long. It's a lot of stuff. Benedict produces a reduced, codified version of that, borrowing from other sources as well. The Anonymous Rule of the Master, St. Augustine of Hippo. And he produces something called the Rule of St. Benedict, which becomes basically the founding charter for monasteries in Western Europe through the early Middle Ages, excluding parts of England and Ireland, which have the so-called Celtic Rite. So he's a big deal in monastic circles, and fittingly does a lot of kind of miracles and such to prove his holiness, which also proves the correctness of following his rule, which everybody's pretty committed to. He even goes so far as to raise the dead on occasion, which is pretty spectacular, but the one we're talking about today is a little bit lower grade. Here's what happens. So, the first monastery St. Benedict founds is called Subiaco, or Sublacum in Latin, but Subiaco is the modern Italian name, and that's where this is set. A monk goes out one morning on an errand into town from Subiaco, and he has to walk all morning. He doesn't get breakfast before he goes. He doesn't grab a potato to eat, of course, because potatoes haven't been invented yet. He's just leaving the monastery empty-handed. And he's out there walking miles and miles and hours through all of the neighbors' yards, and he's hungry. Well, speak of the devil. The devil appears as a fellow traveler he meets on the road and tries to feed him. Feed him once, feed him twice, and he says, no, 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 I'm a monk, I don't eat food. But the third time is the charm. And you gotta watch out for strangers with candy. Because they could be the devil, passing you devil food. Well, back at the monastery after all this, who's made lunch but Benedict himself? And when Benedict makes lunch, he makes those good eggs. You don't want to sleep on them. Never say no to those eggs, Benny. Well, the monk gets into it. Maybe he's eating with less gusto than usual, or maybe, who knows what clues Benedict into something being amiss. Maybe it's just miracle power, but Benedict's like, hold up. You took food from the devil because I am watching you eat with my mind. I saw you eat food that you took from that fellow traveler who is actually the devil earlier. And the monk is astonished, and he says, yes, forgive me, Father, for I have sinned by eating the devil's food. And so he is cured of whatever nasty effects ensue from eating the devil's nasty cake. And he said, and the story kind of wraps up. He says, Se cognovit etiam absentem in benedicti patris oculis deliquisse. The monk recognized that even when he is absent from the monastery, he is committing crimes beneath the ever-present gaze of Daddy Benedict. Well, that's the miracle. Benedict just using astral vision sees this guy eat. Well, I don't know, as often with miracles in this series, the question of why comes up. Why is this a miracle? Why, aside from the somewhat unnatural phenomenon of being able to telegraphically observe people eating, why does this miracle merit being written down in a collection called the Dialogues of Gregory the Great, which is written not that long after Benedict's death, actually? Well, I mean, there are a few things going on here. The first thing is just the basic point that, Benedict was nice enough to make those tasty eggs, and the devil ruined a monk's appetite, so it's a little bit of an object lesson for monks. Watch out for the devil on the road. The broader lesson, as is the lesson in so many of these miracles, is if you're a monk, don't do shit without the senior's permission. Always ask. Always tell your boss monk what you were going to do. John Cassian's big on this also. Shows up a lot in this kind of miracle literature. You eat when the Desert Daddy tells you to, or at these kind of normally scheduled prayer breakfasts that they have at the monastery, because otherwise you are disobeying your senior, the abbot of the monastery, and you are committing disobedience, the primary sin of the monk, and the main way that the devil gets in to hassle him. You are also doing a gluttony, and gluttony is a deadly sin. Even in the earliest lists, it shows up as a deadly sin, and that's crazy, right? I mean, alongside things like wrath and avarice, which involve killing or harming other people, gluttony's in there, and who's gluttony hurting? Gluttony's harmless. You're hurting your own waistline, maybe. Well, to get the importance of gluttony in the moral framework of the early church, and in this miracle, we kind of need to get outside of our comfort zone. And that's basically just stepping outside of, middle-class life in the modern United States, because at most times and in most places, the supply of food has been limited in a way that's really kind of borderline for people having enough to eat. There's enough food for everyone to have enough to eat, but there's not a whole bunch of extra food. For most of history, there have not been warehouses full of ding-dongs and ho-hos and Twinkies sitting in some depopulated town in Iowa waiting to feed us if we run out of food. So in that setting, gluttony is then not just about taking food for yourself, eating a little too much, but it's also about taking food out of somebody else's mouth. You're a little too hungry, you eat a little too much, you are threatening communal survival by chipping away at the collective food supply, which is barely enough to feed everybody. So these conditions of not necessarily famine, but close to famine, are pretty commonplace in, say, most times, most places, but they're especially acute, bordering on famine, in Benedict's Italy. Because Italy at this point is, this is right after kind of the collapse of Roman control of Italy. It's occupation by Ostrogoths, who do actually continue a lot of the Roman administrative apparatus. They take allegedly a third of all agricultural land for themselves, so that's a drain on food. Because the Roman Empire has kind of collapsed and been split up in this way, though, Rome is no longer getting the free food subsidies from Africa that it had gotten in earlier centuries. So we're talking 6th century here. Um, the days of plentiful food in Italy, plentiful food acquired by the Roman Empire, are gone. So there's that. There's also in the 530s a global climate disaster, um, probably triggered by a volcanic eruption, although there's a lot of debate about this still. But a year with no crops, basically. Um, that's on top of generally worsening climate conditions globally. Temperatures are cooling. Um, and on top of that, there's this Roman invasion of Italy to kick the Ostrogoths out, which does so eventually, but it takes a long time. And that invasion is a lot more disruptive than the Ostrogoths running the Roman Empire, because then all the administrative chains of command break down, lots of fields and stuff are getting burnt, you have to feed this giant occupying army on top of everybody else. So that's all to say that it's a world in which food is not plentiful. Um, these are conditions that hold throughout most of St. Benedict's lifetime and probably continue to hold um, when Gregory the Great um, is writing about all of this stuff toward the end of the 6th century CE. Gregory's miracle collection, the Dialogues, has a lot of miracles with respect to food, not just this one about St. Benedict. There are all these stories of saints who can miraculously refill oil jars or grain jars, and in those stories, the conditions under which the miracle is happening are explicitly conditions of famine, where crops have failed, crops have all been eaten, there's nothing left to eat. The saint shows up and he magically refills the oil jar, or magically refills the granary for the monastery. Um, this goes side by side with a lot of miracles that that show the danger of eating. There's one that gets discussed a lot because it's funny, where a young nun, a lady monk, is just, walking around the gardens of the monastery, and she sees this really nice cabbage, and she eats the cabbage, but there's a devil on the cabbage, and the devil gets into her, and she's possessed, and she has to be exorcised. The lesson is, don't put stuff in your mouth without a monk's permission, without the seigneur's permission. Don't just eat because you're hungry, because the devil gets into you that way. And from that point of view, within these conditions where food is really a critical issue, Benedict's spirit surveillance, his ability to keep track of even surreptitious eating on the part of his monks, is a big deal, because that protects them from the devil and it protects the monastery from starvation. This ever-looming kind of wolf at the door in this period of time. Material conditions are important, I think, for understanding this miracle. They're not the whole story, though, because miracles like these are also kind of good advertising, right? They help explain the need for saints. When you might think, hey, why do we even need this football team? Why are we paying for sanctity? Or not paying in a cash sense, but paying in the sense of these monks taking a lot of the agricultural land that lay people could use. Monks boss people around, monks take valuable land and buildings that other people might like to use. So why bother with monks? Well, miracle stories like this explain why. Because worldly food is full of devils. There are devils everywhere. The devils are always threatening to get inside you. You have a nice saint around, maybe the saint is going to take the devils out of it. So from that point of view, getting your food sanctified so that you can eat it safely, having saints, having monasteries, is maybe worth the collective social expenditure that it takes to support these people. In that respect, monasteries and saints are a little bit like Whole Foods, right? You pay a bit extra to have food that's extra holy. And this is something you can try at home, right? I say a lot of these miracles are ones you can try at home. I wouldn't recommend actually going to a Whole Foods right now because of the coronavirus risk. You can, of course, order the Whole Foods Sanctity foods to your house, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that either because, as always, you should be concerned about where the money goes. It's no good spending extra money for holy sanctified food if that money goes to support the devil and his works. Anyway, that's all for tonight. I hope to catch you back here next week.